My grandmother was Ella Margaret Reed. She was born on the 13th of May in 1882 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her parents, William and Sarah, lived at 2545 North 7th Street, down by the river in Philadelphia. When I sent to Philadelphia for her birth certificate, what I got was a monthly page out of the doctor's logbook, and it stated there was a baby born on the 13th of May to William Reed, and the address. No mention of her name, no mention of her mother's name, but they did pay the bill. I guess doctors haven't changed much in all those years. Okay, she lived in Philadelphia, and in the 1900 census, she was living with her parents, but this time 3141 Kensington Avenue, and it listed her occupation as a dressmaker, which goes along with her father worked in a mill, her brothers all worked in a mill, and so the fabric industry was a really big part of their life. Okay, then in 1910, she worked in a woolen mill in that census, and she was living with her parents and her younger brother, who was to get married within about 4 months, leaving her just there. Sometime later in 1910, I really don't know why. Perhaps it was a better job prospect. After all, she was 27 years old, had not been married, still living at home in downtown Philadelphia. But she moved to Piqua, Ohio, where she worked at the F. Gray Company as a mill worker. Then in 1911, she had met and married, on 31st of May, married my grandfather, William Albert Schmidt, in Piqua. She was 29 years old. They were probably neighbors. She did not move there, as I originally thought, to marry him. He was a widower with 3 little kids, and he was, in 1910 census, he was living with his parents, who helped take care of the children. But Ella and William were neighbors in Piqua, and that's probably how they met. I know her address because I have a chest of drawers that was hers, and it says Mrs. Ella Schmidt. It was shipped to Mrs. Ella Schmidt at 2115 Manning Street, which must be where they were living when she was first married. The picture attached to this audio report is of Ella at about 29. Could be her wedding picture, but it shows a very firm and adept young woman. Okay, so they were married on the 31st of May, 1911 in Piqua. My Aunt Mary was born on the 16th of March in 1912 in Piqua. And then in 1913, around Easter time, Piqua sustained a huge, devastating flood in 1913. Both the Manning Street house, where my grandparents were probably living at the time of the flood, and the Green Street house, where they lived after the flood, are on the bend of the Great Miami River. And so it probably was totally inundated with water during the flood. I know Grandma used to tell me stories about this horrific time, but I was a young kid and I really don't remember a lot other than she said it was just awful. I have a picture of the ore company and the devastation that they that was done to them in this flood. The Orr Worsted Mills had purchased the F. Gray Company in 1902. That's where Grandma worked when she first moved to Piqua. The Troy Historical Society has a lot of postcards and pictures of this flood. It must have been awful. January 1914, Grandma gave birth to a son, Frederick William, and he was born January 29th, but he died on February 11th. Don't know whether it was the complications from the flood, lack of food, who knows. Anyway, in 1915, my mother, Sarah, was born. And my mother, her name was Sarah Bessie Schmidt, right? She always hated her middle name, Bessie. And I wished I had known at the point my mother was still alive that Bessie was Grandma's younger sister, whom she obviously adored because she named my mother after her. Maybe Mom would have liked her name a little bit better than that. And, okay, so 1920, Grandma and Grandpa are living on Green Street with all of their children. And for whatever reason, about 1922 or so, 25, somewhere thereabouts, they moved to Columbus, Ohio. And they lived at 1165 Michigan Avenue in a house down in downtown Columbus. And they never owned that house. They never really, that I can tell, owned any house. They always rented because my grandfather didn't think he wanted to be that attached to anything. Okay, my grandpa, I can remember my grandmother and grandfather, Ella and William, both had strokes about 1942, 43. And my dad used to go to work, drop my mother and I off at their Michigan Avenue address, and whatever day that was my mother's day to take care of them. It was coming home from that one of those trips in 1943, and we were on the way back to the farm where my parents lived with his parents up on the Africa Road, and we could see a fire, and my mom thought, oh no, the barn is burning down, and my father said, no, I think it's the house. And that's my Grandma and Grandpa Wright's house burned to the ground because the Westerville Fire Department got lost trying to find them. And they lost everything. And my mother, this was July, and my brother was born in November of that same year. Okay. So anyway, Grandpa Schmidt passed away the 19th of July in 1946. But my grandmother more or less recovered from her stroke. And when my Grandma and Grandpa Wright on the 13th of May, 1951, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, and on that same day it was my grandmother's birthday, and my parents had a big party at the Morse Road Golf Course where we lived at that time. Grandma lived after Grandpa died. She lived half the time with my Aunt Mickey, Aunt Billy and Uncle Mickey, and half the time with my mother and father. She was at Uncle Mickey and Aunt Billy's through the week so she could take care of their son David, and then she came up to live with my parents on the weekends so she could go to church with them. It was at that time that Grandma taught me how to sew, taught me how to crochet, and at those intimate little periods, she used to talk about her family and how she had so many brothers and sisters back in Philadelphia, but I had never ever seen her go back to visit them, and I thought she was kind of making it up. And when I started doing genealogy, I was amazed at all the brothers and sisters that she had. It's very interesting. My grandmother Ella died on the 8th of February 1958. She had come up to my parents' house on the farm so that she could go to church, and it was a Saturday morning, and she always got up really early, but I went down and told my mother, "Grandma's not up yet and she sounds kind of funny." Well, my mother went up immediately to see, and she had had another stroke, and she passed away later on that night, right there in her bed at my parents' house. She was buried at Union Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio, next to her husband, William. And Ella and William had 8 children, besides the 3 that William had with Hattie Maud Rowe. So she had a full and busy life.